the lack of real information about what is happening is a product of the one-party state. There is no real information about what happens in that economy. Everybody's watching out for his or her butt.
When I, as a Cuban, living out of the country, but that was raised there, when I saw the images of the black barracks, los boinas negras, in las calles, on the streets, beating the people and showing their weapons, it was extreme. The least I can say is that it was, for me personally, emotionally, extremely painful.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. Before we start, I have to make a comment about the rout of the military forces of the American-imposed government on Afghanistan. Point number one, it's striking that in all the TV coverage, you never see interviews with U.S. soldiers who were veterans of the Afghan war, or families of soldiers killed or maimed in that war. Remember how we were all told to support the troops. Shows you what the elite really think of the American soldiers. Point two, the Taliban are awful, and one wonders if we'll see another hideous year zero that took place when the Khmer Rouge took over in Cambodia. Yet, why isn't anyone talking about the inspiration for the Taliban and their way of life, anti-women, anti-journalism, anti-anything that we would regard as law? I'm talking about their inspiration, the Saudi Arabian monarchy. They're the model of the Taliban religious thinking. And the Saudis directly helped the Taliban in their first empire in Afghanistan. I will add that despite a few words of rhetoric, Biden is helping Saudi Arabia just the way Trump did. Will the power structure learn anything from this rout? Will it understand that despite all the death it can inflict, its power is limited? And it should wise up and close most U.S. bases in foreign countries. And it should stop imposing neoliberal capitalism all over the world. Past experience says the elite won't learn a thing. Now I want to talk about an excellent panel that will be broadcast on Saturday, April 14 at 1 p.m. Eastern. Now, if you see this show after the panel takes place, no problem, because it will be recorded. The panel is called From Syria to Palestine, the People's Resistance. It's an attempt by RPM to bring together Syrian and Palestinian activists and their allies. The speakers are Palestinian Mariam Barghouti from Ramallah, Swiss and Syrian Joseph Dahar from Switzerland, and Palestinian Nidal Badare, who grew up in Yarmouk, Syria. Yazan al-Saadi will moderate. He's in Beirut, Lebanon. It starts 1 p.m. Eastern Saturday. You can view it live on YouTube and Facebook and submit questions for the panel. On the 27th of July, Israeli military reported that a Palestinian had tried to attack Israeli soldiers with a long metal bar, and they had no alternative but to shoot him. Actually, what happened was that Shadi Sharafi, who was a plumber in the Beita area of the West Bank, went to the pipes of that town carrying a wrench. It was at 10:30 at night. Nothing was going on. There were no, quote, clashes, unquote. But then he was shot dead by Israeli soldiers. Then they took his body and have held it ever since. It has been Israeli policy for some time to take the body of any Palestinian who attacks an Israeli, I should say who allegedly attacks an Israeli, to take that body and hold it as long as the military commanders desire. It is time to confront this demeaning policy, which only gets worse and worse. A petition has been started online. You can get to it at change.org. It's called Return the Body of Palestinian Plumber Shadi Sharafi. We link to it at thestruggle.org. Do you remember this young woman? Her name was Heather Heyer. She was killed August 12th in 2017 in Charlottesville by a neo-Nazi who rammed into a crowd of anti-fascist activists. Others were injured, some gruesomely and permanently. Heather Heyer, presente. You remember this photo from 2013. Over 400 children and near 1,000 others killed in a few minutes in a sarin gas attack August 21st, 8 years ago in Ghouta, Syria. It was Assad's worst massacre. On July 11th, thousands of Cubans took to the streets in protests. They took place in over 60 cities and towns. On August 11th, there was a panel that discussed the demonstrations. One speaker sent in a pre-recorded message from Cuba. The other two speakers were Cuban-born, but are now Americans. We'll have excerpts from these talks that were sponsored by Internationalism from Below and Haymarket Books. We start with the remarks of Samuel Farber, a retired professor from Brooklyn College.
It is 1 month ago, on July 11th, exactly 1 month, that a watershed a moment occurred in the 62 years since Batista was overthrown on January 1st, 1959. There were protests, significant protests in over 60 towns and cities in Cuba from east to west. This is absolutely remarkable. Although there was some limited looting, the demonstrations were mostly peaceful but angry. And I think it's very important to raise the point that there were both political and economic demands. Political demands in the cry for freedom, and it is also important, I think, and this was alluded by Alina, that even though, as she pointed out, she's absolutely right, the demonstrations were very mixed in composition. I think that the presence of the poorest Cubans, and particularly very heavy participation by Black people in Cuba, is very a striking development in this movement. Not surprising that Black Cubans are a very major presence in this movement when they are much less likely to get remittances from abroad than white Cubans are. And of course, the institutional racism that is manifested in many aspects of Cuban society, such as, for example, the tourism. I want to stress that there was no evidence, even the government has not put forward any evidence suggesting or indicating that there were any right-wing slogans at all that were put forward by any of the thousands of demonstrators throughout the 60-plus locations. Nobody raised the issue of quote-unquote humanitarian intervention in Cuba. Nobody raised pro-U.S. or pro-Trump slogans, as one can find, unfortunately, in southern Florida. So I think that that is important to understand. There were hundreds of people arrested. The exact number is very hard to tell as of now. And the trials have begun. How many of the trials have begun? It's also unclear, but the trials have clearly begun, and typically they have occurred in these summary courts that are used in Cuba for minor offenses, and a characteristic of which is that the people who are being judged have no right to a defense attorney. And those tribunals are entitled to impose up to 1 year imprisonment. And in fact, several people already, but the undetermined numbers, have already been sentenced. So by the end of the game, there might be several hundred people who are sentenced, and this would be obviously political prisoners. Of course, none of the brutalities of the police and the special forces won't be on trial here. It is only one side of the encounters are going to be on trial, and the other ones are going to get away scot-free with the abuses they committed. And this morning's edition of La Joven Cuba, of the journal of which Alina is a major figure, has a very detailed article by a Black Cuban student at the university about the abuses that both he suffered and he witnessed. Now, this is like the first part of my comments. The second part, I want to talk about some of the controversies that have happened recently since July 11th, particularly in the context of the American liberal and left milieus. Clearly, there is no disagreement about the causes of the crisis on the short term. There's a general agreement that the pandemic and the collapse of tourism obviously had a heavy economic impact on Cuba. In terms of the longer range causes, there has been a very clear dichotomy in the United States between the sympathizers of the Cuban government that completely ignore the internal political and economic situation in Cuba and only blame the blockade. This on one side versus the Cuban-American right wing and their sympathizers and supporters that completely ignore the very real economic damage that the blockade has had on the Cuban society and economy ever since the 1960s, and particularly in recent days when the Trump severely accelerated the punishments involved in the blockade, and Biden has shown very little interest in softening them. If anything, the press has had articles claiming that Biden, in fact, strengthened the blockade in some key respects. For example, the measures taken by Trump that have not been changed is the fact that it makes it very hard for the Cuban government to operate in international banks, because those banks are threatened by the United States with the fact that if they have commerce with Cuba, they will not be able to have trade relations with American firms. So this is just one example of the many ways in which the blockade is definitely, it's a fact. I mean, there's no two questions about it. Now, let's be clear that the blockade is not about democracy. What it is about maintaining imperialist control of the U.S. backyard, the backyard of the United States. It is interesting that the policy of the United States with the blockading Cuba has been entirely consistent with its policies in Central America and South America, trying to overthrow governments, trying to subvert progressive governments of every kind, and let alone what's happening in the rest of the world. It's very ironic that the United States, for example, condemns the theocracy in Iran, but supports the far worse theocracy in Saudi Arabia that makes Iran almost liberal by comparison. So I think that's very clearly established what the effects of the blockade in Cuba are and its purposes and the reasons for existence. At the same time, however, I believe that it is scandalous, and I will use that word, to talk about the criminal U.S. blockade without saying a word. I'm talking about the recent weeks, without saying a word about the events of July 11th in Cuba, and to talk about the internal political situation in Cuba. And this was notably the case in a very unfortunate way with a very big ad that appeared in the New York Times significant time after the events in Cuba of July 11th, and not a word was said in that ad about what happened in Cuba. Not a word. I I have no problems with what the ad in the Times said in terms of what it did say. I agree with it. The problem was what it didn't say. The problem was that it just ignored the popular movement that had taken place. By the way, something similar happened in Latin America. For example, it's very similar how Andres Manuel López Obrador, otherwise known as AMLO, the president of Mexico, the progressive president of Mexico, sent material help to Cuba, which I think is admirable and should be applauded. But again, no mention by AMLO, by López Obrador, that anything had happened in Cuba at all. So it's something that he would not do if he was talking about any other Latin American country that had just witnessed a popular movement. I think that underlying the attitude of many American liberals and radicals about only talking about the blockade and keeping silent about internal regime in Cuba is the notion, sometimes even semi-conscious, I would think, that is very widespread in the United States, and I've been here for a long time, so I've been able to witness it, which assumes that the Cuban regime and its actions are a mere, and no more than a mere reaction to U.S. policy, and doesn't respond at all to the politics and ideas of the Cuban leadership. So they essentially, in a very bizarre way, these admirers of the Cuban government do not give any agency to the Cuban leaders. They're merely reactors. They don't have an agency. They don't have ideas and politics of their own. They don't have even a notion of what a good society is from their point of view. So they're merely reacting to the U.S. So, and that in fact is historically untrue. The fact of the matter is that the very first year of the revolution in Cuba, there was a very serious, submerged, but nonetheless real struggle between at least two blocks within the government ranks. One was the Raúl Castro Che Guevara and the old Cuban Communist Party, the old pro-Moscow Cuban Communist Party, versus on one hand the liberals who were in the regime and the nationalist anti-imperialists, such as David Salvador, who was the head of the trade unions, Carlos Franque, who was the editor of Revolución, and they were defeated. And it was that defeat by the pro-Soviet. And at that time, Che Guevara was very pro-Soviet. Later, 2 years later, he started becoming critical of the Soviet Union, which I'm not going to go into here. But at that point, he was definitely pro-Soviet, and they won a submerged but real political struggle inside the Cuban government. And therefore, while of course the American blockade played a role that tilted the possibility of victory towards that alliance of the PSP, the old Cuban communists, Raúl and Che Guevara, nonetheless, these people had politics. They were not merely reactors to what the U.S. was doing. And that with that victory, they proceeded to establish a Cuban system model on that of the Soviet Union. I said model, that doesn't mean that every single detail was the same as the Soviet Union, of course not. But the key outlines, the one-party state, the control of the economy, and all of those key issues were copied from the Soviet Union. And then there were certain variations on that theme, just like China had introduced variations on the Soviet theme as well. So, nevertheless, in spite of the fact that many people who oppose the blockade are, in my view, completely wrong about the Cuban regime, the blockade must be opposed. Must be opposed first on anti-imperialist principles, because I believe that socialists or progressive people who are not anti-imperialists, that there's something wrong with those politics. I think anti-imperialism is an essential principle. And also pragmatically, there's also a pragmatic case to make for anti-imperialism in Cuba. Not pragmatic in the sense that one would hope that once the blockade was removed, the Cuban government would become apostles of democracy. Not at all. I think that would be naive to expect something like that. They're not going to change. What would change is the legitimacy and the support that regime still enjoys among substantial sectors of the Cuban population, far from unanimous. Who knows if it's a majority or not? That's a debate that I, for one, have no idea about what the relative weight of those forces are. So that's the issue. It's the pragmatic is to undermine the legitimacy of the regime in the eyes of those supporters of them, who are to a great extent support the Cuban government because of anti-imperialism. So the conclusion is that of course, again, is that we need to oppose both the blockade and, even more important, the highly authoritarian political system that exists inside Cuba. A highly authoritarian regime that has economic consequences. That's what people, in my view, do not come to grips with. It is not simply that democracy is a good thing, and I believe that democracy is a good thing from a political point of view, but in fact, an undemocratic regime like Cuba has a serious effect on the economy. The lack of real information about what is happening is a product of the one-party state. There is no real information about what happens in that economy. Everybody is watching out for his or her butt, and they're not going to admit a failure. So that information that has failed, that is passed on to the higher level, is a distortion to begin with. It's misinformation is systemic, and misinformation that leads to poor economic performance. At the same time, and even more important from my point of view, it's an economy, because of the nature of the political system, that lacks incentives. It doesn't have material incentives, and it doesn't have political incentives that would take the shape of worker control of their workplaces, that there would be an investment of the working class, be it white collar or be it blue collar, in doing things better, because they have a say over what happens there. And instead of that, what you have is a continual indifference, carelessness, try to get service for Cuban people who don't have the hard currency, try to get service in any kind of services in Cuba, indifference, not caring a bit, because those people don't have an incentive to care about what service they're providing. And this is especially a problem in agriculture, because agriculture is the section of the economy that needs the most detailed attention, because it continually faces the vagaries of the weather, all sorts of things that cannot be planned ahead. And instead of that, you have clearly a Cuban government that as Pedro Monreal, a very important Cuban economist, pointed out, is disinvesting in agriculture to put more money into hotels that even before the pandemic were nowhere near working at full capacity. So they're dumping money into hotels and paying much less attention to agriculture. So for all this reason, we cannot argue for the end of the blockade without arguing for the thorough democratization of Cuban society. We cannot argue for the thorough democratization of Cuban society without arguing for the end of the blockade.
Farber ends this section with two calls, one for an end to the U.S. blockade and for complete democracy for Cubans. For reasons of time, we have to stop here, but Farber goes on to make the point, while the left in the United States sees Cuba as socialist, he believes that without democracy, Cuba is on the same path as China, a country with rigid state control and an open door for big business. At minimum, Farber calls for Cubans to have the right to demonstrate freely and the right to associate together in groups as they desire. Now to Odette Casamayor-Cisneros. She's a professor of Latin American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and she writes for truthout.org.
But I want to add to Alina's account some, let's say, the more at the emotional level, how the Cuban people since the 90s, and this is also related to what Sam just said, at least since in the 90s, while I was still living in Cuba, we were continuously living in a situation of constant fear, feeling deprived of agency, of feeling of abandonment. And I insist, from the 90s maybe to the present. And I will say, when I left in the mid of the 90s, but Alina's account is showing us that this the situation is consistent, and it's still present today. And the sense also that we don't have, so the Cubans don't have control on their lives. And as I said, this is something that I remember from my own experience in the 90s, that I have studied as a scholar on my book, and that is everlasting until today. And the fact is that all those factors, this pressure, the Cuban penury that we have been somehow describing has been increased by the COVID-19 crisis. And I want just to, because Alina already talked about that, so I just want to bring some data. The fact, so it is unbelievable, and it's also extremely sad for us Cubans that our country, that is known by being for his notorious health system, social health, so the health system, is right now in the world, so globally, is the 5th country with most cases per 100,000 residents. So this is for us, so we come, those protests come from this sense of fears of, as I was saying, abandonment, this sense that we have don't have control, of sadness. And I believe also that the upheaval will continue, unfortunately. And why? And because the problems that provoked it are still present, continue to exist. Even the recent measures that the government has implemented in the last days, like increasing the basic food basket, etc., they are not enough. They might work like a sort of band-aids, but since the government has not done what they have, the Cuban government, what they really have to do, which is at least show some interest in engaging in a dialogue with its people. And I wanted to talk about this because some of the statements enacted by organizations, leftist of the organizations, start saying, well, we support the Cuban people. But when we read the statement, it's actually supporting the Cuban state, the government. And the confusion, I am not totally blaming them, because it's true that the Cuban state the government has been constantly presenting itself as the voice of the Cuban people. And this brings us, even though I will talk about misinformation a little bit later. I will continue now with this idea of also the necessity to rethink what do we understand from the Cuban people, and more specifically addressed or to think about its more impoverished communities, and of course the in which the Black Cubans are a majority. So I won't emphasize, although if somebody wants to talk more about that, we can do it later. But so I won't describe here the situation right now, the situation of Black Cubans on the island. I will actually limit myself to some examples and some idea on one idea. First, that Black Cubans have very limited access to power. To the extent that, if I was telling before that most Cubans feel they don't have control of their life, they are feared expression, etc. For Black Cubans, it's even worse. Just going beyond the data, let's just use the images. On July 11th, we had first the images of the protest in which, as everybody is saying, there was noticeable. So the presence of Black Cubans was noticeable, of course, because they live in those neighborhoods, etc. But then, when we switch, and so the images that we have right after, which are when there was not right after, the right after, and then the day after of the president Diaz-Canel on this meeting with his working group, we have the totally different image. We have an image of a group of white Cubans that actually, well, they didn't seem to be suffering too much, and this group is the group that is that was taking care of the people. I go back to what I was saying, and it's I think that not only related to Cuba, but I think in general it will be useful for us to go beyond the polarities. Cuba is socialist or capitalist. Not even concerning Cuba, in general, our current global situation everywhere in the world is demanding us to go to see beyond these 20th century polarities. So Cuba, and specifically in the sense of not only Cuba, but all countries that are not self-sufficient. And in the Caribbean, no island in the Caribbean is self-sufficient, never has been, because we don't have the natural resources to self-sustenance. So it means that we are what we can. So I am saying we, even if I don't live right now in Cuba, but in Cubans are what we can. Although in the Cuban case, the Cuban government would have been able to, if this, as we have been telling through all this time, if they have been able to listen to their people, to work with the people and not against the people. And I am stepping a little bit out of the specifically economic question to go to the political one. It is unthinkable in a socialist society. It means in a society that per se is supposed to not represent, but as I said, work for the people, to repress its own people using extreme violence. They have sent the special troops to the street to repress the protesters. And when I say them, it's the government, of course. And these special troops, los Boinas Negras, the Black Berets, they are trained. So when I was a kid in Cuba, I was afraid of them. They were the elites. They are the elite troops, and they are trained to defend the country from, especially for external invasions, for the extremely critical moments. When I, as a Cuban, living out of the country, but that was raised there, when I saw the images of the Black Berets, los Boinas Negras, in las calles, on the streets, beating the people and showing their weapons, it was extreme. The least I can say is that it was, for me personally, emotionally, extremely painful.
Hear what she's saying. The Cuban government called out its Black Berets, its toughest and most skilled soldiers, to beat up the people. As if Trump had called out the Green Berets or the Navy SEALs to be demonstrators in Portland or Washington. I urge you to watch the whole panel. Check it out on the homepage of rpm.world. We end with a Democracy Now! Report on an action by the group FANG, which shut down an entrance at Ratheon on August 13th.
Early this morning, activists with the FANG collective blockaded the entrances to the Ratheon facility in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. The group was protesting weapon sales to Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Ratheon's involvement in the militarization of U.S. immigration policy and the U.S.-Mexico border. Among other things, Ratheon missiles have been linked to the killing of civilians in Yemen.
That's our program for today. See our program at this time next week. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.